It's been 80 years since the victory of the World Anti-Fascist War, and if history teaches anything, it is that forgotten lessons are doomed to be repeated. That's why at the 12th Xiangshan Forum here in Beijing, we're having this important discussion on the contemporary significance of the Second World War, or the World Anti-Fascist War, and we'll reflect the contemporary significance of this pivotal moment and understand how it came to shape the world we're living in today. What should be remembered, or what should be reminded of the world, rather, why these messages are still relevant, and how can we ensure that the seed of war doesn't find, again, fertile ground in the world today. Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from the site of the 12th Beijing Xiangshan Forum here in northern Beijing. As usual, it's a great pleasure to be hosting this panel. I'm Liu Xin, and I'm especially excited today to be joined by two distinguished scholars on stage. They are Mr. Hu Dekun, who is Honorary President at the Chinese Institute for History of the World War II and a former Vice President of Wuhan University of China. Welcome, Mr. Hu. The other guest that we have the pleasure to welcome today is Dr. Harold E. Raugh Jr., President of the International Commission of Military History. It is a non-profit and non-governmental international organization, and it was founded in 1938, aiming to foster and coordinate international research in the field of military history. It's a great pleasure to both guests. A warm round of applause to both of them. How about that, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome. Welcome to the Xiangshan Forum, and welcome to The Point. Without much ado, let's go straight to our discussion, as our theme today is the contemporary significance of the World Anti-Fascist War on the international order after the Second World in the world that we're living in today. We had this massive military parade in the heart of Beijing, which has drawn the world's attention. From your perspective, 80 years on, why should we remind ourselves and the world of the victory and the significance of the victory of the Chinese People's War against Japanese aggression and the World Anti-Fascist War? Please.
I happened to be in Senegal, in West Africa at the time, and that parade received very impressive coverage throughout the world and Africa as well. I think it was very important and a very significant parade to remind not just the Western world, but the world that there was a complete global coalition that defeated the fascists in the Second World War, or the World Anti-Fascist. China played a significant role in that victory that has frequently been overlooked in the history books today, at least from the Western perspective, because the Western allies and the political environment that resulted from the Second World War gave dominance to the Western world. They wrote their books. They gave the lion's share of the credit to what they did. It's frequently overlooked that from the Chinese perspective, fighting from 1931 to 1945, Chinese casualties numbered close to 20 million. In Europe, it's overlooked the contribution of the Soviet Union, or the Russians today, who sustained casualties of 24 to 27 million, civilians and military alike. So those two powers, and they are world powers today, their contribution to the Second World War, the World Anti-Fascist War, has frequently been overlooked.
Dr. Raugh, you pointed out the importance of the role that China played, also the former Soviet Union. Hu Xiaozhang, Mr. Hu, from your perspective, is that pretty much what the message the Chinese wanted to send to the world? Do you think that message has been well received by the international community?
从80年代，中国研究二战时才进入高潮，但是西方在50年代、60年代。
The study of World War II history in China didn't begin to flourish until the 1980s, whereas in the West it had already become matured in the 1950s and 60s. Therefore, when Chinese researchers began studying World War II, we noticed that Western literature on the subject rarely mentioned the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression. They often dated the outbreak of the war to 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, thereby ignoring the 8 years of China's war of resistance from 1931 to 1939. As Chinese scholars, we found this unfair. Hence, from then until now, scholars in China studying World War II and the war of resistance against Japanese aggression have sought to correct this international bias and injustice toward China.
中国研究二战、抗战的学者们都想纠正国际上这个偏见和对中国的不公。所以拉夫先生有这个认识。
Mr. Raw's acknowledgement of this fact demonstrates he is a highly principled historian, providing a fair assessment of China's contributions during the War of Resistance and World Anti-Fascist War. I greatly appreciate and am grateful for
非
this.
常赞赏，并且感谢他在对中国抗日战争的这个肯定。
Thank you, Mr. Hu. When people talk about the Second World War, they talk about the Pacific Theater. And for a lot of people, that term itself is misleading because that largely excluded a much larger, theater, which is China, which is basically it's Asia Pacific or even Eastern Theater. That's why China talked about the Eastern Theater when President Xi was giving that speech. So, Dr. Raugh, from your understanding, how severe is the deficit in terms of Western military research and historical research about the due role and contribution that China made by fighting in the Eastern Theater? How severe is the problem? Have there been efforts to fill that gap? How is the progress?
Any American schoolboy will probably, as well as his parents, state that World War II began on 7 December 1941 when the Japanese conducted an attack on the peaceful U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet harbored at Pearl Harbor. They have little knowledge or appreciation of the war in the China-Burma-India Theater, as it was later called, that took place prior to the American entry into the Pacific War and World War II. The American focus in the Pacific area is mainly, as our moderator kindly mentioned, the Pacific Ocean area. And that's prevalently known by the island hopping campaign of General MacArthur, bypassing islands of Japanese resistance with an eventual goal of capturing or forcing Japan to surrender. Very little is known of the China-Burma-India Theater in World War II, and the Chinese contribution is not as well known or appreciated as it should be. For that reason, the parade celebrating and commemorating the 80th anniversary of VJ Day is very important for enhancing that awareness and putting various groups together, multilateral groups, to make comprehensive, well-researched, objective historical studies of the entire theater of war that took place.
Thank you. Mr. Hu, give us more details, please, because we already know that China has made important contribution in terms of the World Anti-Fascist War. But exactly what are these contributions? How significant are these contributions?
我们是一个弱国，我们的现代化程度跟日本相差甚远，武器装备很
As a weak nation at the time, China's level of modernization lagged far behind Japan's, and our weaponry and equipment were vastly inferior. Yet China persevered. We overcame the odds through the sheer sacrifice of our people. Victory was won with the flesh and blood of our vast numbers of soldiers and civilians. I have come across Japanese documents, particularly their evaluations of the Communist Party of China. In documents written as early as 1941, they questioned what kind of party the CPC was, noting its poorly equipped and low-quality troops. They pondered how the CPC managed to lead the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army in resisting the elite Japanese forces for 4 long years between 1937 and 1941. The Chinese War of Resistance has been largely overlooked around the world. Among the reasons, the way how China fought was different from that of the West, especially from the large-scale military operations commonly seen in Europe, which usually involved hundreds of thousands or even millions of troops. While in China, our war of resistance was primarily characterized by guerrilla warfare, which was a pioneering approach in world military history. It was truly remarkable. We persisted through 14 years of resistance, largely fighting alone. Why do we say that? From the September 18th incident in 1931 to Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, China fought alone against Japanese aggression. Whether it was the UK, France, or other Western nations, they all pursued the policy of appeasement toward Japan, hoping the disaster would be confined to China and avoid its impact on themselves. Later, after the outbreak of the war in Europe, one would have expected China's period of fighting in isolation to come to an end. However, we saw that the UK and France continued their policy of appeasement, making repeated concessions to Germany, which led to the defeat of France and left the British Isles in grave danger. China had to still fight alone until the outbreak of the Pacific War, when the United States joined the war, finally ending our isolation in the war. However, by that time, more than a decade had already passed. For over 10 years, China had been resisting the main force of the Japanese Fascist Army, making it the main theater in the east of the World Anti-Fascist War. Even after the outbreak of the Pacific War, China continued to engage the bulk of the Japanese army. When the Pacific War began, the Japanese army consisted of approximately 51 divisions, with about 35 deployed in the Chinese theater. Given such prolonged and large-scale combat, one must ask, how immense were the sacrifices and pressure borne by China? Meanwhile, China's war of resistance played a significant coordinating and supportive role in the broader global anti-fascist landscape. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviets were most concerned about a potential Japanese attack from the east, which would have forced them to fight on 2 fronts. However, China's resistance efforts pinned down the main force of the Japanese army in the Chinese theater, leaving Japan with insufficient troops to launch an invasion into the Soviet Union. In the Pacific Theater, China's war of resistance engaged the main force of the Japanese army, leading to a severe shortage of Japanese ground troops in other battlefields. This accelerated the strategic turning point in the Pacific War, a crucial contribution of China to the Pacific Theater and its allied nations, including the United States and UK. Chairman Mao pointed out early on that the Chinese People's War of Resistance was part of the global fight against fascism. China was not only fighting for itself, but also for the world, and it truly fulfilled this role. The international community ought to recognize China's contributions. We do not deny the contributions of other countries, especially those with strong military capabilities at the time, such as the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. However, we hope that China's contributions will not be overshadowed, overlooked, or even diminished.
我都很赞成。我们现在中国人开始认识到这些问题，可是国际上的历史学家们是否都认识到呢？
Dr. Raugh, I have noticed something which is rather interesting because if you go into the archives of the New York Times, for instance, actually one of the Chinese think tank did that research and they found over 6,000 pieces of news reports about China's resistance against Japanese aggression while it was happening. Okay? What happened over the years that these kind of voices, that China's role and, you know, they were even acknowledging the leading role of the Communist Party of China. And over the years, that seemed to have died down or gotten forgotten a little bit. What happened?
You mentioned something. At the end of the war, the political situation changed dynamically. The Soviet Union, which had been our allies of convenience, the Western allies of convenience, reverted back, starting the Cold War as the Communist Party. In 1949, we had in China the ascendancy of the Communist Party. And there was a very significant political fear at that time in the Western world of communism. It was perhaps irrational, probably unfounded, but the perception of those who had it was that communism was bad. That's not my own personal opinion. That's trying to put within the context of the time the idea that communism was inherently bad and anathema to the Western democratic and free capital system. So I think for that reason, the contribution of the Communist Party was underplayed significantly and neglected. In the Western powers, they wrote their Western English language or European language history books. By doing so, the intent was to dominate the political spectrum so the West could have a monopoly on the history of World War II. Chinese is a difficult language. Not many Americans speak it. It's difficult to get into source material. That's another reason why the Chinese version of events is not as well known as it could or should be in the Western world.
Let us be fair about what China did in World War II. How does that impact the world we're living in today? Because we talk about the international order, the post-World War II international order, which is, let's say, decades of fighting and collective international efforts. Then we have the United Nations, we had the UN Charter, we had the Security Council, and that system, according to China, is being eroded, right? Part of it is even dysfunctional. So is the discussion on what China did during World War II pertinent and important for understanding what's wrong with the international order today and doing something about it? Hu Xiaozhang, Mr. Hu first.
现在大家在探讨一个问题。
I fully agree with what Mr. Raugh has said. While we Chinese have now come to recognize these issues, I wonder whether historians internationally have also reached the same awareness. Nowadays, a question worth exploring is, how has the new China, in the mere 7 decades since its founding, managed to modernize itself, which took Western nations centuries to complete? Why has China developed so rapidly among its peer developing nations? This is a question well worth our deep reflection, and particularly one for our friends from other countries around the world to ponder. The great transformation of our world began with the end of World War II. The global landscape was fundamentally reshaped, transitioning from an era defined by war and upheaval to one characterized by world peace and development. It is this very shift that has enabled the remarkable achievements of the past 80 years of peaceful development. If we measure these achievements in economic terms, their scale likely surpasses the total progress made over several centuries in the past. The current international order must not be undermined. We can improve its imperfections, but we must also safeguard and cherish it. We should fully leverage the role of the post-war international order with the United Nations at its core to make our world a better place.
Dr. Raugh, for the world to correctly understand China's role in the forming of the post-war international order, how important is that for the peace and prosperity that we have been enjoying as a result of the international order?
It was a bipolar world. Since the end of the Cold War, the political situation has not been as stable as it was in the past. China has made Herculean efforts, and I really applaud President Xi's global governance initiative to maintain international order, but that's not what is happening. Part of the world is in chaos. International order has broken down. The United Nations does not work. Drastic changes need to be made. And as they're being made, the world is changing. It's undeniable, it's palpable, and it's visible before us on a daily basis. The world is shifting economically, demographically, to a degree militarily, from west to east. China is playing a pivotal role in all of those aspects, the economy, the military, and other items, and is doing a wonderful job in maintaining that international stability. There are Western countries, in my personal opinion, that still consider themselves to be empires. They are not. Their perception, their self-perception of being an empire is falling apart. Some of these Western countries are failing. They're ailing. They're flailing. And when they do that, they look at other more successful countries and try to denigrate them. There's jealousy involved. And they try to instill a spirit of fear at times within its own population against more successful nations.
Dr. Raugh, I'm going to interrupt here once again. And as a devil's advocate, some people would say, where did you get your viewpoint from? Because you certainly served in the U.S. military, right? You have always followed the U.S., I don't know, discipline, opinion. I don't know since when you started to think this is the world's, for instance, gravity is pivoting towards the east. May I ask that question? Because people will be asking that question in their head.
Yes, ma'am, certainly. I think it's undeniable. I think a person who uses their analytical ability of their brain and reads as many multiple sources of information, winnowing out the news that is unreliable, looking at statistics, looking at perceptions, looking at the people of a nation, these things are happening. Personally, and I don't want to get too personal in this, yes, I'm a retired U.S. Army officer. I believe in my country, but I also believe in cyclical types of history. Some things don't last forever. There are changes in the economy, changes in technology, changes in many other aspects of the world that, as I mentioned, are changing and shifting. Simple data points are look over the last 20 years, year by year, over the busiest airports in the world. We need to accept reality And we need to appreciate the anchor point that China is willing to serve to preserve a rules-based international order. And that's really important right now. All of us read the news on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a question about how the parade has been perceived. You know, I'm not saying what is the intention, but it definitely has been perceived by some people, some certain media with a negative light, saying, look, China has all of these massive and high-tech weapons. China is going to use them, you know, and the soldiers, look, there's, you know, they're like machines and so on and so forth. So this is further evidence of the so-called China threat theory, but China has been saying, we are the shield of peace. This is for deterrence. Mr. Hu, how do you look at the kind of negative perception and comments that have come out of the parade? What would you say to these people?
从新中国成立以来，
Since the founding of the People's Republic of China, it has never initiated a war against any other country. Some of our neighboring nations have relatively weak military capabilities, yet we have never used our size to bully the weak. On the contrary, we have declared to the world that China will not follow the Western path where all strong countries will seek hegemony. Instead, we will consistently pursue a foreign policy of peace, striving to contribute more to global peace and the cause of common development. Therefore, there is no need to have such concerns for China's military parade on September 3. Rather than being a threat, China's growing military strength should be seen as a guarantee for world peace.
和平的一种保障。谢谢。
Thank you. Dr. Raugh, very quickly, would you want to add something, your point?
Perceptions are reality to those who have them. Some people will consider the victory parade or the VJ Day celebration parade in a fear-mongering manner. I try to look at it the way Ronald Reagan used to look at it, is demonstrating peace through strength. I think China has done a fantastic job over the decades in watching part of the world on fire and concentrating its efforts domestically on its civilian population, taking care of its people, and making contributions to that stability of the international order.
Many thanks to my two guests, Hu Dekun, Honorary President at the Chinese Institute for History of the Second World War, also former president of Wuhan University of China, and Dr. Harold Raugh, Jr., president of the International Commission of Military History. And many thanks to all of you present today. Thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.